Prepare for at least 9 months of economic pain. That's the word coming in from former Cisco boss and now venture capitalist John Chambers. In a recent interview, Chambers noted that this health and economic crisis will take 3 to 5 quarters to run its course, and any green shoots will emerge only later in the year, and a full recovery is unlikely until early 2021. In fact, a survey of top 286 early-stage founders and 114 venture capitalists about the future by leading VC firm NFX shows that about 40% VC see a recovery only between April 2021 through April 2022. The study also found that the biggest worry for founders right now is venture capital funding drying up as sales decline. So as funding dries up and companies run out of cash, it's quite evident that only the strongest, or shall we say the smartest, will survive. Hello and welcome to Young Turks, India's longest running show on startups and entrepreneurship. I'm Shereen Bhan. I'm joined by one of the most successful CEOs of Silicon Valley, John Chambers, one of our favorites here on Young Turks. John, always a pleasure. Many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. It's good to have you back on the show.
Shereen, it's going to be a lot of fun today, a lot of topics to cover.
Absolutely. So let's get straight to it, John. Over the last 25 years that you've been in business, running Cisco, you've gone through many up and down cycles, including health pandemics like the bird flu of 2005. What do you believe is different about what we're seeing today? This kind of uncertainty, the fear, the doubt in the minds of consumers, and how do you see this playing itself out when it comes to business decisions?
So in the sequence you raised it, Shereen, I've been through 5 economic downturns, 5 various healthcare crises, everything from Zika to SARS to the bird flu to this one, 3 supply chain issues. And each of those we played through over time well. And as you articulate at the very beginning, many companies adjusted quickly to it and then positioned themselves for the future. What is different this time is you have all 3. So by far and away the most serious pandemic we've seen in our lifetime, probably the quickest economic downturn we've ever seen, probably double digits in GDP growth in the US as an example, and then also supply chain issues that are tied together from various countries around the world. So it's the speed of that change that is very, very key. What is different this time, however, is how quickly governments and the central banks and businesses and the citizens have come together to deal with this. And I think the U.S. is navigating through it. It's very likely we flattened the curve. You're beginning to see huge emphasis from the Fed and from the Treasury to put money into the system to keep job growth and to maintain jobs. And you see India do one of the best jobs, I think, in the world underneath Prime Minister Modi. So what's different? It's moving much faster. It's 3 things at once. But the governments this time are responding quicker, and so is business, and so are the citizens.
You're right about the fact that we've seen coordinated central bank action, and perhaps the most aggressive has been the Fed in new measures being announced even this evening by the Fed. Of course, we've got those unemployment numbers to deal with as well. We just had Bill Gates on, and he said that no government has a magic wand to turn the economy around. I'm paraphrasing, but that is the sum and substance of the message there from Gates. Now, yes, we've seen all of these measures being announced by various governments, but you still have the health crisis which has to play its course. So in order of priority, what will be the next steps that you expect from governments and central banks?
Well, I think, Shereen, you said it very well, and I admire Bill and his giving back, and he's a very good friend. I think you have to do these in parallel. You have to do your best to flatten the curve on the terrible pandemic in front of us, and tremendous thanks to the healthcare workers who put their lives in danger every day to make that happen, whether in New York City, in India, or around the world in Europe. But you've got to move in parallel with the government, and they're moving fast in most countries. And you begin to see the government working with businesses to say, how do we keep as many jobs as we can? How do we begin to lay a foundation for creating new ones? How do we help companies navigate through this? And how do we take the human lives first as top priority, then the economic growth second, and how do we parallel these together? I'm an optimist by nature, as you know, but I'm a very realistic optimist. I think I said at the beginning, back in February, this was a 3 to 5 quarter phenomenon, most likely. I think that's true. I would love to see a V down and V back, but I think we're going to have a very tough second quarter and third quarter globally. Then I think you'll begin to see in the fall and the winter it come back. And then you'll know really in first and second quarter next year, are we getting the traction and were the programs as hopeful and as effective as we hope it will be? And will the therapeutic capabilities to address people who have real extremes in terms of the issues with their breathing with drugs like hydroxychloroquine that you all manufacture there in India, maybe having a key role in our future as well. But that's pretty much the way I'm positioned for my companies. I ask them to develop a game plan to navigate through this, the 5 to 7 major things they have to do, from employees to cash preservation, to interface with their customers, to big bets they might make in the future, to paint their picture of the North Star as they come out of this, to communicate regularly with employees and with their shareholders and with their customers and their partners. And if you do it right, as you said in your opening comments, you will navigate through this. This is when companies, leadership, it's all about it and how good are the leaders. And then you'll see a number of new companies emerge from this, both in India, in the US, and around the world, that really will become the next powerhouses in the industry. But you have to first get the patient off the emergency room table. You've got to say, how do we go through this as the united front? And I like very much the way the governments in the world are working together with businesses and with the citizens. So cautiously optimistic, it will get tougher before it gets better, and no one knows for sure. There's no immunity here. But repeating the same thing, Shereen, you basically have seen the Indian government, I think, respond among the very top governments in the world. And the infrastructure that Prime Minister Modi built over the last 5 years, his vision on being able to do transfer payments and to connect people digitally. When I interface to the startups in India, it's just like I'm here in Silicon Valley. I did a session just yesterday with 120 people out of one of my startups there. So I think India is taking the right steps, has had the courage to do this, not just in the last couple of months, but over the last 5 years. You have a very charismatic, very effective prime minister leading that.
Yes, John, I want to focus a little bit on this playbook that you put forward for us on navigating companies navigating themselves out of trouble. And while a lot of the emphasis, I would imagine, in boardrooms is going to be on cost rationalization, on trying to ensure that you keep the people that you really need, and maybe you will have to make tough decisions on letting others go. In some of that, you may tend to lose out on growth opportunities, or you may lose out on focusing on the customer. Now, how do you balance the two? And I know that you've been able to do this quite successfully since you've gone through 5 down cycles. So how do you balance the focus on growth opportunities, potential growth opportunities, the customer, while you're focusing on cost rationalization and just survival?
So you articulated, I think, very well, and let me give you examples each step of the way. It is important to have a playbook. Your 3 to 5 minute positioning to your employees, your customers, your shareholders on how you're going to navigate through this. You've got to be able to say in that playbook how much of this was externally inflicted, how much internally. Let's assume for now the majority is externally inflicted by the pandemic and the economic downturn. Then, to your point, you've got to survive. So every company that I interface to, I'm saying have a scenario A, B, and C plan. A means you're going to grow slower than you thought this year. B means you're going to grow a lot slower, and C even further. You then develop each of the steps, and it starts with cash preservation. It starts with really battening down the hatches very carefully on expenses. It takes it communicating to your employees what is the strategy and how you're going to treat your most important asset you have, which is your own employees and your customers, different through this. And then you communicate to these groups the 5 or 7 major programs you're going to do, including your North Star for how you come out of it. Cisco did this very well in 1997 and 98 in the Asian financial crisis, at a time that most of the high tech, especially in Silicon Valley, withdrew out of Asia. We doubled down and put one of our best sales leaders over there. And 1 year later, we had #1 market share in every major country. In 2001, I got surprised, but we made our moves very quickly. And that's the second key takeaway, Shereen. It's important to make your decisions once, and it will probably last longer than you think and be deeper. But you make it very crisply, and then you position yourself for the upturn. Cisco made all of its changes in 51 days. 2008, the Great Recession. This time we saw it coming. We interfaced to our customers differently, and we actually extended to global automotive companies credit for the use of our technology at a time that no other company would give any equipment to those companies unless you gave cash. The companies paid you in cash. We built relationships, and we came out of it even stronger. So to answer your question, it's a playbook that I think you can fine tune. And then as you make your changes, then to the point you make, the world-class companies have a chance to say, how do we position for not only what we look like when we come out of this, but is this a chance to potentially break away? And that's what I'm beginning to do with my 18 startups that I'll talk later today with on how do you do that.
You know, that's an important point that you made, John, on the companies that will look at this as an opportunity to break away, so to speak. And you've pointed that out previously as well, that many of the great tech companies have emerged during times of economic crises. I want to go back again to the Cisco example, because I think it was during the bird flu pandemic of 2005 that Cisco came up with telepresence, the first video conferencing product for remote meetings. And, you know, we're seeing that take off in a big way during this current crisis. So how should people be looking at opportunities in the midst of this crisis?
Well, I think, once again, Shereen, we are in complete sync in terms of how this occurred. I was in Mexico in 2005 meeting with the president of Mexico, his cabinet, his whole team when the bird flu pandemic hit. And fortunately, it was originally much worse than actually occurred. But it looked like nobody could meet together. And so when the president and his cabinet did not come to the dinner that evening, only their spouses did, I knew there was a problem. 1 year later, we introduced telepresence and put it into key governments in Mexico and within the U.S. had President Bush and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the governor of California at that time, show how this technology could be used. It was a very good opportunity to learn how to use video, but the infrastructure was not there globally really to take advantage of this, nor were the ease of use with features like Zoom and Google Hangouts there. And so now what you see is the ability to work virtually, very effective, whether you're in call centers, whether you're engineers, whether you're in retail. And just using myself as an example, I go around the world today with 5 conferences like this with large groups and with 4 individual meetings with my CEOs, et cetera. This is the new norm. And because of this and the infrastructure that is in place in the US and also in India, and that took foresight, you are able to really adjust very quickly. I don't think, Shereen, it ever comes back like it was before. I think we'll do the majority of our meetings in the future by video, even if we're in the same office.
Okay, so if you don't see it coming back to the way that it was before, then what will the new normal be? Work from home is probably going to be a lot more prevalent, as you pointed out, maybe more video meetings, less travel. What is it then going to mean for these legacy sectors like travel, hospitality, aviation, John? And what is it going to mean for these new tech companies?
Well, in the reverse sequence you raised it, Shereen, I think it's an opportunity for startups in India and in the US, as well as established companies to reinvent themselves. You're going to see the call center, customer experience industry driven by AI dramatically transform that experience that is hard today when you call in the call centers. In the future, it will be so much easier, and the agents there will be able to help you so much because they'll be coached through how to interface to their customers at the other end. In terms of industries, I think all industries will come through this. Some of them will recover quicker than others, and some of them will adjust the new technology even faster. But as we come through it, I think it will be a rolling economic recovery, both by industry and by geography. I think the U.S., and I think with 25% of the world's GDP, it's so important the U.S. lead here. So I think the U.S. will be a good indication with the coordination among the political parties, Democrats and Republicans, and the administration to make the change, the Treasury, the Fed we talked about earlier. If I were betting on one country in Asia, I'd bet on India, as you and I discussed, in terms of how the changes are occurring there and how India is positioned, both because of the vision of the past, what was put in place in terms of infrastructure, digital transfer payments, et cetera, on it. I think Europe's going to be a little bit tougher. I think it's going to recover slower on it. I think you see nations like France leading the way, but they don't have quite the infrastructure or the economic power behind it that we alluded to earlier. In terms of the individual segments, it might surprise you. We see airlines and even transportation groups saying, how do I skip a generation and prepare for a digital future? And so rather than just surviving this, they're saying, first, what do I have to do to survive? How do I position myself for the future? And then they say, how do I move to a digital future? I think that's what leadership is about. So we in the business world have to say, how do we protect jobs? How do we create jobs? How do we protect our employees? Government has to say, how do we do the best we can? And nobody's immune from the challenges on the healthcare crisis, and then working together. And that's what perhaps is the most exciting thing I've seen. I've seen businesses and citizens and governments working together in a way and a speed I've never seen before.
We'll take a break, but when we return on Young Turks, we continue our conversation with John Chambers on the post-COVID-19 playbook. Welcome back. You're watching this Young Turks special. We're in conversation with John Chambers on his post-COVID-19 playbook. But John, you talked about how this is going to also change the way we've looked at supply chains. And while that shift has gradually started to happen out of China to countries like India, more so countries like Vietnam, etc., what will COVID-19, a post-COVID-19 world, mean in terms of how the supply chain has been structured?
Well, Shereen, you again hit on something I think people are just beginning to take a hard look at. I think one of the lessons learned, and I've been through 3 supply chain challenges, 2 positive, 1 negative, an example being the tsunami and the earthquake, a terrible event in Japan, where even if you had a small component of your supply chain that was single sourced in a single location, if it got cut off, it affected the whole upward movement. So I think you're going to see a lesson that probably we should have learned before. You can't be dependent upon one country or one geography for your supply chain. You've got to have multiple approaches to it. Secondly, supply chain has not changed dramatically in the last 20 years in terms of the systems and the approach. So when you talk to the Federal Expresses or others, you begin to see them look at this dramatically different than before. This will be an opportunity for both startups moving into it, where you literally use the Internet of Things to connect the supply chain and you track by individual items. It will also be an opportunity for large companies to reinvent themselves. And so I think what India has done very effectively on many fronts, and again, as you know, I'm a huge Prime Minister Modi fan in terms of what he's done, but his vision of a digital India, a digital manufacturing, I think has laid the groundwork and infrastructure to allow India to leapfrog many of its global competitors and to really make a change. So I think it offers challenges and opportunities for it, but supply chain will probably be, as we work our way out of this, what you'll start to see a lot on your show and others, people refocusing that we didn't really prepare for this properly in terms of supply chain architecture, and how do we really use digitization to change it.
John, I want to talk to you about the mood in the Valley. What are you hearing from founders? What are you hearing from VCs at this point in time? We brought up this survey, which is basically suggesting that fundraise could be a big challenge. What is that going to mean then as far as innovation and growth is concerned?
So a combination of questions. One thing, Shereen, that I think is very important for people to understand, most leaders were not in a position of either being CEO or head of a venture capital firm 12 years ago with the last downturn. And more than half the employees of most of these companies have joined their companies in the last 12 years, so they've never seen it. And I think there's a natural tendency when you fall into this to get shocked, to respond step by step, as opposed to take a step back, as we talked earlier, understand how much was self-inflicted and how much was done by the market. The venture capital, and being fair to a number of the firms, they got too aggressive, in my opinion, on growth at all costs, as opposed to growth combined with profitability, combined with free cash flow. All 18 of my startups, including Unifor and Lucidius out of India, I've focused on growth and profitability from the very beginning. To your second part of your question, the first thing companies have to do is stabilize. You've heard about the Black Swan letter from one of the top venture capitalists here. I think that was a little bit extreme, but you're seeing preserve cash and then determine where they're going to bet in the future, and which companies can they really bet on, which ones do they kind of help survive through this, and which ones perhaps are they not going to be able to support. To the third area, if you haven't been through it before, it always looks darkest just before the tide changes. And while I'm a realistic optimist, I think much like you can now see the light at the end of the tunnel, and you have to have a sliding scale. Whether we're breaking out of this in the fourth quarter this year or the first or second quarter next year, I think you see the plans in place to do this. Probably 10 to 20% of the venture capital firms would disappear. I think we got an awful lot of firms in that, and an economic shakedown is usually when you see the strong emerge. Same thing true as startups. Unfortunately, we're probably going to see 30 to 40% of startups disappear over the next 2 years. And this goes back to why the startups, and if I were talking to the startups in India and the US, picture what you have to do to survive, position yourself to protect your employees and your customers, get closer to your employees and your customers, and communicate constantly how you're going to navigate through this and your progress, and then prepare for the upturn. And then, if I could give you some real aggressive advice, prepare for how you break away during the upturn. What are you going to do differently? How are you going to take this terrible events that are in front of us, deal with the world the way it is, the way my parents who were doctors taught me to do, deal with it not the way you wish it was, but the way it is, and then position for the future. I think we'll come through this well, but I think the next 12 to 18 months will be very bumpy. The next 2 quarters will be very tough, Shereen.
Yes, they will be tough. Lots of turbulence ahead. But John, before I let you go, as an investor, given the fact that you believe that a post-COVID world is going to be very different, what will be the themes that you would like to bet on? Where would you like to put your money post this?
Well, it's a great question. And what it really says is you have to have leaders think about the future, be realistic about how painful the current situation is, but you've got to have your dreamers who can execute on it, help others say, how do we navigate through it? So in terms of technology, probably the one that I'm most excited about is artificial intelligence. It will probably exceed the expectations that are out there in the market, where many of the other technologies hype was probably above their ability to deliver. They will come slowly over time. The Internet of Things combined with artificial intelligence and the cloud moving to the edge, nice terms, but what it really says is it will probably change the leaders there as the transactions occur at the edge of the network, not back in a central cloud location, and the opportunities. Customer experiences, I think call centers, and a lot of them there in India and in the US, will go through a huge transformation where not only will their agents and virtual coaching as you go through it, and call summary at the end to provide a much better experience for their customers. And what companies focus on during this time-sensitive area is cost savings. How do they maintain their existing customers, prevent churn? How do they upsell on those customers? And security. So security is going to also be, I think, a very hot area in this area at this time period. And 8 of my 18 companies are in the area of security as well. In terms of geography, I like the US, trying to see it go across the entire nation, not just our East Coast and West Coast with startups. I like India a lot. So I'm clearly betting on India. And in France, I'm betting on President Macron and his focus on making France an entrepreneur nation again. So that would be the sequence that I would go in terms of my own investment and what I believe are the most likely winners as we emerge out of this.
Well, John Chambers, it's always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18 with your playbook on how to navigate ourselves out of this COVID-19 crisis and what the world could possibly look like post that. Thanks very much for your time, and stay well and stay safe. With that, it is time for us to head into a break, but don't go anywhere. There's a lot more coming up here on the channel right after this short break.